I'm Tracy Sabol. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, turmoil in the Middle East. Ahead of the U.S. Secretary of State's return to the region, Israel conducts strikes on northern Gaza and bombs several parts of Syria. Concern in Canada. The Premier of Quebec says he wants to ban prayer on sidewalks and in public spaces. Church leaders respond. Feeling the heat. Thousands are under evacuation orders as California authorities try to contain a massive wildfire. Plus, focus on France. A report from Corsica on the preparations ahead of a visit this weekend from the Holy Father. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us. Our top story tonight, we begin in Syria. Leaders around the world and Syrian citizens themselves are drawing their own conclusions about the future of the nation after the fall of the Assad regime. The supreme leader of Iran is pointing his finger toward who he believes is responsible for the upheaval.
یک نقشه مشترک آمریکایی و صهیونیستی است.
The Ayatollah says the fall of Syria was the result of a joint effort by the United States and Israel. It comes as Israel carries out a wave of airstrikes across the country and its troops advance deeper into a buffer zone between the Golan Heights and Syria. Israel denies that it is heading towards the capital city of Damascus. Meanwhile, life in the city is starting to return to normal after Assad fled the country, with banks and shops reopening. Additionally, thousands of displaced Syrians are now crossing the Lebanese border to return home. Pope Francis weighed in on the recent conflict and called for peace in the Middle Eastern nation. The Holy Father says, quote, "I hope that a political solution will be reached that, without other conflicts or divisions, will responsibly promote stability and unity of the country." The upheaval in Syria has sparked new fears of instability and uncertainty in the region. And tonight, the Biden administration has been trying to navigate the sudden challenges. That includes sending its top diplomat and national security advisor to the Middle East this week. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen.
Tracy, one of the national security concerns continues to be ISIS. That's the Islamic State group. Right now, the U.S. has about 900 troops in Syria, preventing ISIS from taking advantage of the dynamic situation there.
With Syrian President Bashar Assad gone, his mansion in Damascus gutted by the public, the future of the country remains unclear. For one journalist, mixed emotions.
And I'm hopeful for the coming days, but also I'm really scared because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if the coming government or the coming regime would be better. Hopefully it will be better.
Meanwhile, the U.S. now focused on the terror group ISIS, saying the counter-ISIS mission by American troops in Syria continues, and warning that the Islamic State group loves nothing more than ungoverned space. Overseas in Japan, observing military exercises, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin told reporters,
"As you've heard me say, my number one priority is protection of our troops. And we're also very much focused on making sure that ISIS doesn't have the ability to research."
Over the course of Syria's nearly 14-year-long civil war that killed nearly 500,000 people and displaced half of the country's pre-war population of 23 million, Kurdish fighters, known as SDF, partnered with the U.S. to rout ISIS.
As you know, we've worked alongside the SDF for some time, and that work continues. Again, we have a good relationship with them, and I think it'll remain that way.
Meanwhile, over the coming days, in the waning days of the Biden administration, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan head to the Middle East. For Blinken, his 12th visit since the Israel-Hamas war erupted last year, and his first trip since the ouster of Assad, which sparked new fears of instability in a region now racked by multiple conflicts.
One can say that the Syrian army doesn't exist anymore. What was maybe a little bit surprising was the fact that it was such a rotten and corrupt army that they did not resist.
Now, the U.S. has had troops in Syria for the last decade battling ISIS, and officials say more strikes on ISIS, like those that occurred earlier this week, will continue. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
All right, thank you, Owen. And for more, we turn to Ambassador William Roback, Executive Vice President of the Arab Gulf States Institute and a senior advisor to the Special Representative for Syria. Mr. Ambassador, great to be with you today. As we heard from Owen, the Secretary of State is headed to the Middle East. What would you like to see and hear from him? And are you concerned about a threat from ISIS?
I think, to take your latter question, Tracy, there remains a significant threat from ISIS. They are primarily located in ungoverned space in some of these places between cities, major cities in Syria, and those 900 U.S. troops are working closely with our partners over there, the Syrian Democratic Forces, on that problem set. So it remains a significant threat. And I think one of the things that Secretary Blinken will talk about, I know he's going to Turkey. My hope is that he will talk to the Turkish officials and urge them not to attack Syrian Democratic Forces, our partners, because it will distract from the fight against ISIS. It will put the prisons in northeastern Syria that are detaining these ISIS fighters that have been caught and captured. It will put those prisons under a significant threat. It will also make it difficult for the Syrian Democratic Forces to guard the bases where our troops are located. So it's a tough problem set, and I'm hoping that when he goes to Turkey, he will raise these issues.
Yeah, and Mr. Ambassador, there's also a lot of concern right now about the Christian population in Syria and other religious and ethnic minorities. In fact, speaking of the Secretary of State, he said earlier today that he is not confident that HTS, the rebel group, will protect minorities there. What say you?
It's a significant challenge. In these types of transitions, when we see what has happened in the past, in the beginning, there has been a relative calm, and then sometimes that calm has not lasted. My hope is that they find a way to create some sort of coalition government and a transition that will be stable, and that it will be able to protect the minority populations in Syria, including, of course, the significant Christian population, which is primarily located in Damascus and the greater Damascus area, but is also in other parts of Syria.
Yeah, and I know in a recent article that you wrote that the clear winners in the removal of the Assad regime are Turkey and Qatar, and the clear losers are Iran and, to the lesser extent, Russia. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that and why you say this?
Well, I think Hayat Tahrir Sham, HTS, has relations with Turkey. I think Turkey gave them some assistance, although they're not as close a proxy as some of the other groups Turkey works with. I think there clearly was some coordination and help, and Turkey stands to benefit a lot. They oppose the Assad regime, and they're, of course, happy to see the Assad regime go, and this situation with HTS will give them a lot of influence in Turkey, in Syria, and in the way that things move forward in Syria. As far as Russia and Iran, Iran, of course, has had a massive strategic defeat in Syria, and that's going to reverberate for the weeks and months ahead. All their forces have had to be pulled out. They've lost all of that influence, and they had massive influence in Syria. So it's a huge strategic setback for Iran. For Russia, it is also a significant strategic setback, but the final chapter hasn't been written for Russia yet. A lot of their forces are still in those bases that they have in Tartus on the coast and in Latakia, the air base, and they, I think, are trying with the forces that ousted Assad to keep those bases and to keep access to them. And we'll see in the coming days and weeks if they're able to do that.
Mr. Ambassador, we are almost out of time, but quickly, I want to pick your brain about this. President-elect Donald Trump has basically said that we should stay out of Syria. I want to know what you think about that. Is that possible?
I think we should keep our troops in northeastern Syria. I think they're doing an absolutely vital fight against ISIS. I'm hopeful that President-elect Trump will make that decision to keep those troops there. and to continue our partnership with the SDF in the fight against ISIS.
Okay, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you, sir, so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Tracy.
The FBI director says that he is stepping down at the end of President Biden's term in January of 2025. Christopher Wray will be resigning 3 years short of the 10-year term that he was appointed to back in 2017 by President Trump. He made the announcement during a town hall meeting with agency employees, saying his decision is the best way to avoid, quote, dragging the Bureau deeper into the fray. This comes not long after President-elect Trump announced his pick of Kash Patel for the head of the FBI. Trump praised Wray's decision to step down, writing on Truth Social, quote, the resignation of Christopher Wray is a great day for America, as it will end the weaponization of what has become known as the United States Department of Injustice. I just don't know what happened to him. We will now restore the rule of law for all Americans. The deadly U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 is back in the news again. Secretary of State Antony Blinken testified before a House panel today, ending a months-long dispute just weeks before the end of his term. More than 2,600 American troops lost their lives during the 20-year conflict there, costing U.S. taxpayers more than $2 trillion. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports now. Eric.
Good evening, Tracy. Yes, Secretary Blinken's testimony before the House Foreign Affairs Committee comes just 3 months after the committee voted along party lines to find Blinken in contempt of Congress for failing to show up to some of the panels. Well, actually, the chairman of the committee, Republican and Congressman Michael McCaul, was quick to point out the problems that took place during the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Mr. Secretary, to preserve optics, you sacrificed the safety and security of our service members, diplomats, citizens, and allies. You treated terrorists as diplomatic partners and created an environment ripe for chaos.
And I think today especially of the 13 heroes that we lost at Abbey Gate, and I deeply regret that we did not do more and could not do more to protect them.
Secretary Blinken began his testimony by recognizing Gold Star families of U.S. forces killed, turning and then apologizing to them. Cries of genocide from demonstrators in the audience disrupted the proceedings, resulting in a number of arrests. Blinken testified the pullout deal Trump made with the Taliban left President Biden with no alternative.
Had he not followed through on his predecessor's commitment, attacks on our forces and allies would have resumed, and the Taliban's assault on the country's major cities would have commenced. That would have required sending tens of thousands more U.S. forces back into Afghanistan to defend ourselves and prevent a Taliban takeover.
So I believe that President Biden ultimately made the right decision to end our 20-year war in Afghanistan and not ask another generation of Americans to make an ultimate sacrifice for a war that no longer had a purpose.
Since the pullout, the U.S. has provided more than $2.6 billion to international organizations to aid Afghans. Republicans say that they don't want another dollar sent.
0.1% has no doubt gotten to the Taliban in terms
I don't care if it's
fees,
that gum penny. I don't care if it's a penny. I mean, for you to sit up here and admit that our enemies, I mean, these people swear to hate Christians and Jews.
Since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, Blinken adds that the State Department has conducted its own investigation and has made some nearly 40 policy changes that are now being implemented in other countries, such as Israel and Lebanon. I also want to let you know that the National Defense Authorization Act, that's the what funds the Department of Defense, that actually passed the U.S. House and it's on its way to the Senate. A vote is expected next week. It's the largest funding bill for any agency at $895 billion. I'll have exactly what's inside the bill coming up tomorrow on EWTN News Nightly. Tracy, back to you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that. Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi says that she still takes communion even though her Archbishop prohibited her from doing so. In an interview with the National Catholic Reporter, Speaker Emerita spoke on a wide range of issues, including China, abortion, the elections, and her feuds with bishops. Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco famously barred her from receiving communion in 2022 because of her pro-abortion stances. When asked about it in the interview, she said, quote, "That's his problem, not mine. My Catholic faith is Christ is my Savior. It has nothing to do with the bishops. The Archbishop has since responded on his website, saying in part, "First and foremost, I would like to renew my request for prayers for the speaker's conversion on the issue of human life in the womb, that it be consistent with the respect for human dignity she displays in so many other contexts." Well, officials in Southern California say the wildfires grew significantly overnight, with the blazes reaching more than 6 miles, and thousands of people have evacuated their homes. Firefighters have been battling the blaze while climbing steep canyons, while others, as you can see in this video right here, have been hosing down hot spots on burned properties. The National Weather Service says the strongest winds have passed and better weather conditions are expected. And there's much more to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including still on the rise. Inflation has gone up again, why it's so high, and where you're likely going to feel it the most. And after a push to end prayer in public places, a group of bishops is speaking out. We'll have a look at the new proposal. A proposed law in California seeks to protect minors from the harms of social media. The legislation would require social media companies to warn users that their platforms could pose risks to mental health of young people. The proposal is backed by the state attorney general, as well as a mother who lost her daughter by suicide following a social media addiction. While new report says that inflation in the United States moved slightly higher last month, the spike was fueled by higher costs for hotel rooms and groceries. Consumer prices rose 2.7% in November from last year. The inflation figures are the final major data piece that officials from the Federal Reserve will consider before they meet next week to decide on interest rates. And for analysis, we turn now to Patrick Horan, research fellow on monetary policy and the Federal Reserve System at George Mason University. Great to be with you. So put these numbers into context for us and what it all means.
Sure. So the inflation, the CPI numbers for November were roughly in line with what was expected. And frequently people look at the headline number and then the core number that strips out food and energy, the argument being that those are volatile categories, so core might be a better indicator of where headline is going next. So both those indices rose 0.3% from the previous month. Headline was 2.7% from the previous year, as you said. Core inflation was 3.3%. Now, what that means, though, is that inflation is still pretty hot. The Fed's goal is to get inflation down to 2%. And now they actually look at a slightly different, they look at a different indicator called the PCE inflation. They look at what's called PCE inflation, not CPI. Even so, though, we presume based on this CPI reading, PCE is still going to be above 2. So we still haven't gotten inflation down to where we want it to be. Yeah,
and Patrick, for those of us that aren't economists, in layman's terms, what does this mean for consumers?
Well, the Federal Reserve is expected to go through with an interest rate cut next week at its last that's, as you said, it's going to be its last meeting for the year. Now, normally you want to raise your target interest rate if inflation is too hot, not lower it. However, they had said in the past, well, we think we want to cut our target interest rate a bit just to make sure unemployment doesn't rise. So I think what's going to happen is that unless something major happens, the Fed's probably going to go through with its interest rate cut next week. But then it will pause further cuts into next year, and then what interest rates will look like will depend on what the data looks like as the new year starts.
Yeah.
I would say that interest rates are probably going to be higher for longer than people were hoping a few months ago. A few months ago, inflation looked like it was on its downward trend, and unemployment was rising. Now we're sort of seeing the opposite situation.
Yeah, there was a survey that was released earlier this week by the Federal Reserve revealing that households are really feeling optimistic after Donald Trump's election, and they're expecting their financial situation to improve. What do you think is fueling this optimism?
Well, it's hard to tell. It could be there could be the consumers might be thinking the new president might pursue some good policies. Maybe he'll get rid of some bad regulations, or maybe he'll cut taxes more. I think as the new administration starts and we'll get kind of a better sense of their priorities, we'll see if that's true or not. I suspect a lot of people think that President Trump is business savvy, and I think that's probably why they become more optimistic.
Yeah, not a whole lot of time left, but Patrick, your predictions as we end the fourth quarter.
Well, unemployment is still pretty low. It's ticked up a tad in the past couple months, but it's still at 4.2%. I think back in September, in August and September, the Fed was afraid, unemployment might rise a lot, we might be in a recession. Hence, we're going to start cutting the target interest rate rather than keeping it where it is. I think labor markets are still looking pretty good. I am an optimist by nature, but I do think we should be leery about inflation. I think we don't want to be complacent on it. I hope that the Fed really takes inflation seriously after this week. I hope they don't cut interest rates too much too quickly. Otherwise, I think we could see inflation reignite, and that would hurt a lot of people, especially those of lower income.
Yeah, definitely. Patrick, thank you so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Well, a supermarket super deal is now off the shelves, so to speak. Albertsons has backed out of its $25 billion merger with Kroger. Both a federal and state judge rejected the deal yesterday, siding with state and federal regulators. It would have been the largest supermarket merger in U.S. history, but there are concerns that it would limit competition as well as hurt customers. Today, Albertsons filed suit against Kroger, saying that it did not do enough to secure regulatory approval of the deal. Up next on EWTN News Nightly, making history, the unprecedented trip Pope Francis is making this weekend and how the people are preparing to welcome him. Plus, a new push to ban prayer in public places where it's happening and how the local bishops are responding. In the state of Montana upholds a recent decision to allow so-called gender-affirming care for minors. In a unanimous ruling, the justices say the measure is likely unconstitutional. The injunction will remain in effect until a trial. Montana is one of at least 26 states that has enacted bans on so-called gender-affirming care for minors. All moving overseas now, the government in the United Kingdom announces an indefinite ban on puberty blockers for children. The move comes after independent experts told the government that there is an unacceptable safety risk in prescribing the medication. The ban will be revisited in 2027. One children's advocate in the UK praised the decision, saying in part, quote, "This day will go down in history as the day that safeguarding of children came back into existence." Church leaders in Canada are speaking out against a recent proposal to end prayer in public places in Quebec. The Canadian press says François Legault, the premier of the province of Quebec, backs a proposal to ban prayer on sidewalks and in public parks. It is part of a push to strengthen secularism in public schools. One bishop in Quebec says that he was, quote, "stunned by their proposal." In an open letter, the church leader also says in part, quote, "A religious group can organize a public gathering for purposes other than prayer, in particular to raise funds. Will we then seek to ensure that no prayer is recited during a food drive or before a friendly meal? Praying is not dangerous." Pope Francis calls on the faithful to be sowers of hope.
Perché dopo la resurrezione lo Spirito Santo è il vero alter ego di Cristo.
And his weekly talk at the Vatican, the Holy Father says that hope is not an empty word or vague desire. Instead, it is a certainty based on God's fidelity towards us. Pope Francis also weighed in on the Holy Spirit, saying that since the resurrection, he is the, quote, alter ego of Christ. Pope Francis' final apostolic journey this year will be next Sunday to Corsica, a small French island in the Mediterranean Sea. The Holy Father will spend an entire day on the island, which is preparing to welcome a pope for the first time in its history.
Good evening, Tracy. We are on the French island of Corsica, where the local people are preparing for the papal visit on December the 15th. This morning, we visited the Cathedral of Ajaccio, where Pope Francis will meet with religious authorities such as Cardinal François Javier Bustillo, head of the church in Corsica, along with bishops, priests, and religious sisters. He has accepted the invitation to this French island to participate in the conference on popular religiosity in the Mediterranean. Corsica is not only known for being the birthplace of French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, but also for its strong popular devotion. The young people on the island often belong to fraternal unions here, where they celebrate their faith in different ways. During the patron saint festivities or the Feast of Our Lady of Mercy, processions fill the streets with life and music. In an interview with EWTN this morning, Cardinal Bustillo, who extended the invitation to Pope Francis to visit Corsica, said he was surprised when the Vatican confirmed the possibility of the trip. He said he hopes the papal visit will leave a mark of hope on the population, where almost 80% of the people are Catholic. December the 15th will be a busy day in Corsica. The papal flight will arrive at Ajaccio at 9 a.m. where the official welcome ceremony will take place. He will then proceed to the Ajaccio Convention and Exhibition Center to address the members of the conference. This meeting will be followed by a gathering with bishops, priests, and consecrated people at Our Lady of the Assumption Cathedral. There he is scheduled to deliver his second speech at 3:30 p.m. Pope Francis will preside over Mass in the large park known as Ucasone. The square houses a large statue of Napoleon. Later in the day, he will meet French President Emmanuel Macron at Ajaccio Airport and return to Rome. This is the 47th papal trip, and the Corsicans are expected to welcome him with great enthusiasm. In Corsica, France, Paola Riasa, EWTN News Nightly.
And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, X, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sabol. Good night, and God bless.